Good morning, ladies and gentlemen from Brussels. My name is Robert Madlin, and I have the pleasure and privilege to moderate this discussion during the hour ahead. As you probably know, if you're here, the EU-UK Forum is a recently established platform for discussion, debate, and exchange of information focused on the relationships between the UK and the EU of 27. We want to be constructive, we want to have informed dialogue, and all of your insights, expertise, and ideas are very welcome in this hour and beyond. For this hour, the first webinar of 2021, we have chosen to focus on health in the broadest sense, to look at medicines, devices, equipment, to look at the health workforce, to look at the cooperative delivery of public health and healthcare services across newly constructed borders. And in order to do that, we're very lucky in that the Nuffield Trust had thought of the problem and has recently published a new report, which you'll see the reference to in our materials. So we have three of the co-authors of this report, who I want to introduce to you now, and then we launch the conversation. And during the conversation, please use the chat function to ask questions, and our moderators behind the scenes will feed the questions to the speakers. First up, we have Professor Tammy Hervey, the John Monnet Professor at the University of Sheffield. Then Mark Diane, who is the Brexit lead at Nuffield Trust, has been instrumental in organizing as well as creating this new cutting-edge report. And third, Nick Fahy, a former colleague of mine from the Brussels bubble, now a research fellow at Green Templeton College at the University of Oxford. So Tammy, Mark, and Nick, welcome. Let me start, Tammy, with you. You are an expert in EU law, and you have been looking at some of the legal and regulatory changes that have been inserted by the withdrawal agreement and now the post-Brexit agreement, the Christmas agreement as we can call it. What do you see as the major elements of continuity, and what are the major, perhaps surprising omissions that we need to focus on going forward?
Thanks, Robert, and thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this forum. It's a great pleasure to be here. So, major elements of continuity across the two relevant agreements, the withdrawal agreement and the trade and cooperation agreement, are in some ways, pleasingly, things to do with human beings and when human beings move. And given the fixed position of the UK in terms of the type of Brexit and the type of future relationship with the EU that the UK chose, in particular choosing to be outside of the single market, unlike other near neighbours, the protection of the entitlements that human beings have across both of these two agreements is really welcome. In particular, protection for the coordination of social security, not just for people who'd already moved before the end of the transition period on the 31st of December 2020, but also for people who move in the future. So from the 1st of January 2021, there is some protection of social security entitlements. And of course, that is a concession in a way on the part of the EU, because there is one way of thinking about those social security entitlements that makes them part of internal market law, because they're about supporting the free movement of people. But that's obviously not the way the European Union has conceptualized those entitlements in this agreement. What does that mean for health? Well, one of the most important things it means is that something like the EHIC arrangements, where visitors go between the UK and the EU and can access the health system for necessary care, those provisions will continue going forward.
Thank you very much. And if I can go a little further then, does that mean that in practice nothing has changed? or will there be perhaps at the sort of practical level more checks before a hospital or a doctor will give you a service that you need if you don't clearly come from the place where you're seeking the service?
So just in terms of the EHIC type arrangements, or the arrangements for cross-border residents or pensioners who've retired, there are some changes in terms of the requirements of paperwork. So those covered by NHSs in the UK need to, once their current EHICs expire, need to get a new GHIC, Global Health Insurance Card. I'm not sure why it's global, because it's currently only to be recognised by EU member states. So those paperwork things are necessary. But the Trade and Cooperation Agreement thought about human beings as human beings. So there's a provision in it that says if you don't have your GHIC, you can get a temporary one immediately, and indeed not just you, anybody on your behalf. So a relative on your or friend could ring up and get you a provisional one straight away. So that looks like more continuity than we feared when we were looking at no deal Brexit. There are some things that will change in terms of the content of what's available. So kidney dialysis, for instance, kidney patients used to have very strong relationships, in fact, the individuals with hospitals and other units where they could go on holiday or visit family in EU member states from the UK, and they used to do that on the basis of EU law. They're not going to be able to do that without authorization from the UK under the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. And of course, we don't know under what circumstances the different NHS trusts will actually grant that kind of authorization. So for some individual human beings, that is a huge change. It might make the difference between somebody being able to go and visit their grandchildren or not.
Yes, so I understand that, but at the same time, I have to say the overall story that you tell means that for human beings, it's better than, for example, if you read the headlines this morning, fish. So actually, rather surprisingly, in an area which is not central to the competence of the treaties, somebody did a good or better than expected job. If we move on, Mark, to you, firstly, I'd like to ask you, how did Nuffield Trust do so well in terms of having a report out right now on the impact of Brexit? How long did it take to do that? What's the human story behind this piece of forward-looking work of the sort that the forum stands for? You're muted, Mark.
That's Robert. Obviously, this was with Nick and Tammy and also our colleagues at the University of Michigan in America. I mean, the secret, it won't surprise many people know, is that we started well before the stage at which a Brexit deal was actually in the offing, and trying to work at a fair clip as well. And I think it is worth tracking back through the last 6 months to remember that at least once negotiations had started in the spring, we did have a reasonable idea of where a deal was heading for. So it was always clear that it was going to be framed, at least in the UK side, as a free trade agreement with some bolt-ons, particularly around security. That does set the parameters of what you might expect, particularly in areas like medicine, science. And there were some surprises, like I think Tammy has described there, with regards to the movement of people for health-related purposes or health-related provision for people who are moving back and forth. But by and large, it's the binary distinction of Brexit was staying in the single market or leaving it. And once we had a negotiation where we were definitely leaving it, I think it was quite clear what the issues were likely to be for sectors like medicines, trade and medical devices.
Yeah. So, and before I come to ask you about trade and medicine and medical devices, I'm guessing that the Nuffield Trust, having produced this report, will continue to be part of a sort of vibrant conversation to make sure that we manage the results of the agreement in a way that's mutually beneficial across the Channel, across the north-south border in Ireland.
Yes, absolutely. So we hope to keep doing this sort of tracking and monitoring project for Brexit, which has, I think, roughly three aims. Nick and Tammy may or may not agree with this. The first being the simple sort of accountability task of tracking the effect of the decisions that have been taken and the way that the UK and to some extent the EU responds to them. The second being to sort of monitor, engage with and inform ongoing discussions, formal negotiations and otherwise between the UK and the EU to sort of suggest ways forward and highlight issues. And the third being to look at UK relations as well with the rest of the world as those change in a post-Brexit context, which again is maybe important to mention.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't want to lose the global aspect, and as Tammy herself noticed, suddenly everything is global. But focusing in then on therapeutics, devices, equipment, if I can ask you the same question as I asked Tammy, I mean, is there essentially continuity, or is there rupture? Are there breaks in the system, as the French would say? Especially given that we see headlines where there's a degree of competition about speed to approve vaccines. There are the beginnings of debates about can we have active divergence where we perceive European regulation to be more red tape than British people would like. And there may be divergence in some of the sort of advanced therapy areas. So is it, firstly, looking at the agreement, is it essentially continuity? What are the gaps? And secondly, how do you see the future? Is it more convergence and the building of additional cooperation, or is it going to be potentially including some tricky issues?
It's a good question. I think there are elements of continuity, partly resulting on the UK side from the fact that it inherits as a starting point processes that are identical to the EU, and that many of the technical standards that underlie these regulations are global to some extent in any case. But there are very important elements of discontinuity. So if you look at both medicines and medical devices, the single market was a reality in nearly every stage of regulation, from the authorization of a new medicine through to the approval of the factory that makes it, testing of individual batches, and then the customs union and related aspects of the single market that made it quite possible to move the finished product frictionlessly around the continent. And three of those four levels, we see discontinuity as a default. The only one where mutual recognition has at least been agreed is the what's called good manufacturing practice. So inspecting factories to make sure that they're working in a safe and consistent way, and that what they're producing is going to be consistent with the medicine they've been authorized to produce. I should say, I think that may or may not be the end of the story. The pharmaceutical industry, both in the EU and the UK, are quite keen to see if we can explore the possibility of mutual recognition of batch testing as well. So the testing of individual lots of medicine to make sure that they're compliant, safe, etc. I think there are good arguments for that from a health systems perspective as well. This is, a fairly standardized type of regulation. There is an element to which, if you force people to duplicate the costs in the UK and EU, it really adds very little from either an industry or a patient or consumer point of view. And it certainly is possible to do mutual recognition agreements like that, even fully outside the context of wider trade negotiations. So there is an agenda where I think the discontinuity could lessen. But by and large, it does mark a significant break with the UK's time as part of the single market.
Yeah, and if I move to the second leg in my question, what do you make? I mean, I'm reading this stuff in the newspapers in Brussels, as it were. What do you make of the beginnings of debates about shall we make a break for a different framework around gene editing, around novel therapeutics? Because that's clearly an issue where there is a political appetite, at least to examine the merits of divergence in an active way.
Yes, I think that's quite true. What we found for our report at the end of last year, when we went and spoke to various people in industry, in different arms of government, in the regulatory side and the health service side, is a great deal of interest in things like that, but not necessarily terribly well fleshed out actual proposals. And I think to some extent, there is an international set of aspirations about the long-term reform of clinical trials, where they make more use of all the data that can be generated now, to make it possible to do them quicker and in some cases with fewer people than are currently required. What I would say about that is that, again, while that is an agenda around divergence, and I think a lot of it is about looking for ways that the UK can remain relevant and keep making a contribution to life sciences, even when it won't be part of the EU's clinical trials system, which under the new regulation will create a more streamlined way to do cross-national trials within the single market. Even though it is about an agenda of competitive divergence to some extent, there still, I think, will need to be a dialogue on some level with the EU and European regulators, because the interest from industry, I think, is likely to be less in new forms of trial and new criteria for authorization in the UK if those are completely irrelevant to what the EU and indeed the US, the other major global market, want and will accept. So in a sense, the UK has a very difficult balance to strike here between several different factors. It obviously needs to reconcile the need for safety and rigor with the desire to offer people a quicker way to market that will make the UK competitive. And then it also needs to reconcile that with not striking off on its own so much that it becomes a separate, much smaller market, which may not be so competitive for investment.
Yes, I'm glad you mentioned the US, because I was going to come to that next. I mean, it's clear that as the Biden-Harris administration takes office this week, there's going to be plenty of interest around the world in new relationships with a new and perhaps for some preferred American administration. And I know from past experience that both EU and UK researchers and companies in the pharmaceutical space are very much interested in the US angle. The US has the VC, US has the market. Do you think there'll be a sort of triangular competition in a good way, either looking, for example, for more mutual recognition on all three sides of that triangle, building on the Clinton-Prodi pharma MRAs, as well as on a new UK-US angle and the UK-EU? Or is there a risk that somehow any two of those parties will try to squeeze out the third?
I think that's a very good question. The UK is never going to be a large enough market to compete with the EU or the US, or increasingly China, as a major sort of market / hub for life sciences innovation, I don't think. And part of the policy question that we probably need to either answer or at least bridge a compromise with is to what extent the UK remains to some extent integrated in a European life sciences community, which may be the best bet in terms of actually competing with the US and China in the future, both for the UK and for the EU. But with that said, there almost certainly are opportunities to cooperate more with the US. Interestingly, those didn't really come up too much when we had the early stages of US-UK trade negotiations. The focus from the American side was largely about intellectual property and to some extent payment mechanisms, essentially trying to get the UK to pay more for medicines. And the UK's orientation was quite a defensive one aimed at heading that off. But I think there are potentially more productive ways forward. And one thing that you've seen, which is quite interesting over the last few months, is the UK has joined the ACSS collaborative on accepting medicines authorizations from across different countries like Australia. And those sorts of kind of poolings of decision-making and regulatory capability do, I think, have the possibility to reduce the friction that the UK might get if it genuinely did, which I don't think is viable, try to pursue a strategy as totally freestanding, separate entity for both receiving and researching medicines than the US and the EU.
I think that's a very interesting point, because so I asked about a triangular virtuous spiral, and what you're revealing, because I wasn't aware of ACSS, is actually there is a lot of scope for plurilateral better regulation in the space, at least between those jurisdictions that genuinely respect each other's capacity.
I think that's right, and it's something that there has been some policy interest in within the USA for some time, partly prompted, I think, by concerns about the FDA sometimes approving new medicines later than the EMA does. There is, of course, we're kind of skating across many different areas of regulation here. So I think that particularly applies to the authorization ends of things. There are areas more around research that shade into treatment, where I think it absolutely will make sense for the UK to remain particularly integrated with Europe insofar as that's possible. And so one example of something that has been lost is the European reference networks for rare diseases, which combined research functions and actual treatment functions with patients moving back and forth to look at rare diseases where typically you don't have the patient base either to maintain services or do research in one country. And there's nothing in the trade and cooperation agreement about these. They are they have, I think, been lost, which is a shame because the UK had quite a large role. It was the lead, its institution was the lead in about a quarter of them. But there are aspects of it which Tammy has spoken about in terms of there still being a role under the agreement for sending patients back and forth with authorization, which may help to keep some of those networks alive. And that obviously, at least insofar as it involves actually moving patients, is something that it is, you know, the UK's natural partner will always be Europe.
Yes. Just before we move on to Nick, there's a question from the audience. Could someone explain the ACSS, Mark? You and I dropped into acronyms.
Yes, sorry about that. The problem is it is now a rather confusing acronym because it stands for Australia, Canada, Switzerland, and Singapore. 4 countries who started it, but now there are some other countries in it as well. And it's essentially a group of countries which get together to create ways for firms with new medicines to sort of streamline an application to all of them to some degree, rather than going around with separate ones to these sort of medium-sized markets who on their own are never going to be as much of a priority to launch your new product as the US or the EU.
Yes. But at the same time, it's an example of collective regulatory innovation. And we've seen with the sort of rolling reviews associated with the vaccines, also the development, at least the socialization of a technique that hastens the time to market. So there's plenty of scope to do better. I'd like to just move on now to Nick, but as I do so, ladies and gentlemen, there are 1 or 2 questions coming in. So unless you want to find at 11:58 CET or 10:58 UK time that there isn't time for your question, remember to feed them in good time. Nick, if I pass to you, you have throughout the Brexit period been advising legislators in the UK and researching at your university as to what this all means. And before that, of course, you and I worked together building some of the structures to which the UK now has a new relationship. So I'd like to start by saying, you know, compared to the 2 stories that Tammy and Mark have told, how do you live this? What do you see as the new baseline that we've now set? Is it sort of 9 out of 10, 1 out of 10? And what do you see as the big issues? And what are the issues where continuity is achieved and where more work to build some continuity is needed?
Thank you very much, Robert. And my thanks to you for hosting and moderating this, and to Dan for convening it in the EU-UK forum. I should also mention that part of the answer to your earlier question to Mark about how were we able to do this so quickly is through the generous funding of the Health Foundation, who helped to fund the report that was produced by the Nuffield Trust. And I should also thank the National Institute for Health Research, Oxford Biomedical Research Centre, who funded those previous years of research, Robert, as that you mentioned, as well as the work that Tammy and I were doing for the Parliament. So 1 out of 10, 10 out of 10. I wanted to focus in particular on workforce in terms of looking at that. And it's such a mixed picture across these different areas, because in some areas, so Tammy identified some areas where actually there's quite a lot of continuity, and Mark has talked about a lot of the continuity in relationship to medicines and to goods, which is where I think there's been a lot of focus. But one of the things that's really surprised me about this discussion is that the relative advantage of the UK economically is around services and around people, and yet that's such a weak part of the agreement. So you might say it's sort of 7 or 8 out of 10 on some of the personal and goods elements, but it's a sort of a 1 out of 10 on services and people. And if we look at workforce, it really illustrates that, because the UK is distinctively, and in European terms, it is the most reliant for its health and social care workforce on people who are born outside the UK. And yet there is almost nothing in the agreement which helps to maintain the flow of staff from the rest of the European Union, which has been part of ensuring that we are able to continue to provide health and social care across the whole country. There is, of course, the possibility of immigration, and we're moving to this points-based immigration system, but that has a very unequal effect and not a very helpful one as far as the health and social care sector is, because points in this instance tends to mean money. There's a very strongly economic focus to this, and it's around salary. So it's about, what do you earn when you come in? And if you're a relatively specialist or advanced doctor, then you will be able to come in. But although maybe your family won't, and maybe it's not so interesting to you if you can't bring your partner, because this isn't just about people coming at early stages. This is about one of the attractions of the UK historically has been as a place where people could come part way through their careers, because it offered opportunities for professional development in health in particular that were maybe not so easy to access elsewhere. But we've all seen through the COVID pandemic the enormous importance of the social care sector. We talk about the NHS, but the NHS is only one part of how we provide health and care to the population. Social care is never going to get above any salary threshold you ever set, basically. Yet it's been a route for frequently very skilled people to come into not just the UK, but other economies, establish themselves, and then find the space for them in the economy, and perhaps the recognition of their qualifications. And I'll come back to that in a second. So it creates real challenges. And there's there's 2 other things that I would want to highlight. One of them is the specific challenges for Northern Ireland. So we've talked a lot about this sort of half in, half out. So on your scoring system, Robert, the situation of Northern Ireland gets some slightly different scores from elsewhere, because it's this sort of half in, half out, but only as far as goods are concerned. And so what we have is a situation where the island of Ireland functions in many ways, as far as health is concerned, as a single entity because of the way the population is distributed and the way the workforce works. And yet now, yes, there are the common travel area freedoms which apply to British and Irish citizens, but they don't apply, for example, to EU nationals who aren't British or Irish, but who wanted to, for example, move to Ireland and then find that there's a professional opportunity in the north of Ireland, because that's the way the health system works. And so that's going to be a particular challenge, and maybe the focus of where we should be looking for how this moves forward. And then there is the whole question about mutual recognition of qualifications, where the trade and cooperation agreement between the UK and the EU is essentially an agreement to make agreements. So there isn't agreement on mutual recognition of professional qualifications. There is an open door that both sides might choose to walk through to create agreements. What's interesting actually is how those agreements might be made, but I'm conscious that I'm giving you a long answer to a short question, Robert, and so I will stop there and let you direct where you would like us to go.
No, but I think that's already very helpful, and one thinks of Schrodinger's cat. So Northern Ireland may be okay or not okay, but we don't know until we experience it. But in the report as well, so let me focus on that for one moment. In the report as well, you referred to some areas where critical mass health service provision on the island of Ireland depends on cross-border cooperation, whether for oncology or for social services. And in those circumstances, it's a bit the same point that Mark was making. The critical mass depends on cooperation beyond the jurisdiction. And so I think that's already an interesting fact. whether people think of it, whether people sitting in London, for example, think of it as just a Northern Irish epiphenomenon, I don't know. But is it in fact clear enough that all of that can go on happening? Because you've mentioned the common travel area, but there's also the so-called Good Friday Agreement and the North-South cooperation there. So the principle of continuity in terms of governance structures across the border is sort of an exception to the divergence by default, discontinuity by default model that Mark referred to, or is that too optimistic?
Well, that depends on whether or not you read it literally or pragmatically. And I'm always reminded, Robert, so one of the things that you and I were both differently involved in was the establishment of the European reference networks and the cross-border cooperation when we were both colleagues in the European Commission. And I'm reminded of one of the cross-border instances between Aachen and Maastricht, where they had different regulatory requirements on different sides of the border. And the chief of police, memorably in one of the situations, because there were requirements about ambulances, and for example, different horns, and the chief of police just said, yeah, I just go deaf when I hear those ambulances go past. And I sort of, the tradition of European cooperation is we make it work and then we formalize it later. And I wonder if that border between Northern Ireland and the rest of the island of Ireland is going to be the place where the pragmatic solutions are found. Because yes, we have the peace programs, and on the one hand, that's only funding. It's not an answer to the legal questions about recognition. It's not an answer to the regulatory divergence, but it is a strong political signal. And so if there is somewhere where people are simply going to find pragmatic solutions, make stuff work, and rely on the fact that nobody who is going to make objections is going to be looking too closely or wanting to cause trouble, then I hope that that it will start, we will be able to see things there. But what I also hope is that it doesn't just remain an unofficial pragmatic solution for Ireland, because what we want that to be is the laboratory that then becomes the basis of a wider dynamic of cooperation and development for the rest of the relations between the UK and the EU. And if I take one example from recognition and professional qualifications, I have a rather brilliant South African PhD student who is also a medical doctor and who's been trying to help out here during COVID. And I think he's well over a year in at this point to the process of having his South African medical qualifications recognised within the UK, and it's still going. So this is not a straightforward process. We're talking about real practical challenges. What's in the TCA is, interestingly, the possibility for the professions to work out agreements. And I think that might actually help both the UK and the EU. And I'll just say one word about that. I think it might help us learn things from these kind of practical situations like the one across the border between Northern Ireland and the rest of Ireland. But we have a much wider workforce challenge within the whole of the EU. We know that we face workforce difficulties. We know that we need different skill mixes than perhaps match the current definitions of the different professions. We know that we have challenges in terms of migration from the east to the west and from the south to the north. And we also know that the Professional Qualifications Directive is perhaps not the most flexible regulatory structure, but is also so sensitive that no one quite dares to go near it. So there is perhaps a scenario where, by letting the professions come up with something that is professionally led in the context of the opening up of recognition and professional qualifications between the UK and the EU, we might manage to come up with something that is a bit more flexible, a bit more suited to the adaptations that the professions themselves think needs to be in place. And that might itself lead to some constructive change on the EU side as well. Yeah. But this is in the most positive of all positive worlds.
Yes, but you raise a very important point, because I see this discussion this hour and the forum itself as looking to the future. And so we have scope for professions to work together. Indeed, it's a free continent still, so there's nothing to stop any actor in the health system from reaching out to any other actor and coming up with ideas. But I want to turn back to Tammy, because Jean Monnet, your chair's named for him, famously said, you need people to create things, but you need institutions to sustain cooperation. And you were saying in the chat that you're quite worried about pragmatic solutions because, unlike the EU, they are not based on the rule of law. So if the men pass on as people leave, you can have drift. So how do you see a way forward? So I'm going to ask a very complicated question for a very short answer. How can we best favour people-to-people cooperation to build the bits we need to add to the TCA, which will be consistent with it, so that then the endorsement or framing of that becomes a no-risk step for the institutional managers of the cross-channel relationship? Is that feasible, or is that the sort of thing that lawyers think is dangerous?
How can we best enable people to come up with solutions to a problem that has unfortunately been created? Give them resource. Yeah. Give them resource, and get them together physically in a room. Because lovely as this is, it's not the same as working physically in a room. And actually, Mark and Nick and I and the others who were involved wouldn't really have been able to write this long report so quickly if we didn't already know each other, and if we hadn't already been in a room. So yes, there's an opportunity there for both the EU and the UK and professional organisations and whoever else, the pharma industry, I guess, whoever else is interested, incentivise people talking to each other, and then the structures will follow. My point about the rule of law is a slightly different one, more to do with the possibility of holding governments or other powerful actors to account. That it sounds logical and rational to us for the chief of police to turn a blind ear to the wrong ambulance horn. Of course it does. But what if the wrong ambulance horn means that some kind of awful thing happens? You need law to figure out who's liable. So I would never support a situation where the legal position is not clear and is not being followed.
Yes.
But I do think that Northern Ireland, for lots of complicated historical reasons, is a special case. And actually, the withdrawal agreement creates institutions in addition to the existing institutions on the island of Ireland, and structures that will help going forward. So again, if I'm required to be as positive as I possibly can, the settlement between the withdrawal agreement and the TCA with regard to Northern Ireland is nowhere near as bad as it might have been, partly because it does create these new institutional structures. I'm sorry, that wasn't a short enough answer to your question.
No. But it's a very good answer, because it produces some new ideas. So if I then take your point about resource people-to-people processes and give them places to meet, and we go to the professions, as Nick said, and I'm assuming he's right because I haven't read it in enough detail, it is open to professional organisations within the EU and in the UK together to agree certain things. And at the same time, there was an interesting question in the chat around, are professional qualifications automatically going to be mutually recognised going forward? And the answer is no. Divergence is possible under the agreement. So we have, but we do have well-structured professional organisations. Are they the solution? I mean, could we imagine a sort of EU-UK TCA umbrella for a lot of profession-to-professional conversation, do you think? Does anybody think? Nick thinks. Nick?
Yes, but. So the TCA opens the door to that, but it says the professional bodies or the authorities. So one issue here is, because on the UK side, the UK has always had a tradition of leaving a very high proportion of the regulatory power for the professions to the professions. That isn't necessarily the tradition in all the EU member states. It's not to say that the professions wouldn't be interested and aren't able of doing that, but that balance of involvement is different in different countries. I think there would be an opportunity here actually to create a bit of space which wasn't just ministries. but it will depend on how they wish to do that. But above everything, I would absolutely echo Tammy's point, which is it's creating the opportunities and the spaces for that to happen. One of the things that that the Commission has always relied on in health, where its historical powers have been quite weak, has been what among others, Robert, you used to refer to as the convening power. Just the ability to bring people together. And I really hope that this agreement will be seen as the start of a convening space, if you see what I mean, and have weight put underneath it. The only thing that slightly makes me nervous about that is that then on for example, in the medicines area where Mark was talking about competitive divergence, as it were, in some areas of this agreement, there is clearly a lens of the way in which we make this work is by going different ways. And we need to be nuanced enough to understand that in some areas we're going to want to actively go in different ways, and that might actually be constructive. And in other areas, we absolutely want to use this as a vehicle for cooperation, and we shouldn't let the competitive divergence of some areas undermine the possibility and the interest of convergence and creative discussion in others.
And I want just to
I was going to just add to what Nick said, if I may. It is in a way unfortunate that the TCA doesn't decide, is it the professional organisations or the authorities? If we had a structure in the TCA that was a bit more like the parts of EU competence, where it's the social partners that have the power to make the agreements, if that was clearer, that would actually be better. So there's a bit of a barrier there in the sense, and I mean I guess there just wasn't time to discuss this. If there's no time to discuss it, you put both in. You say or. So that is unfortunate. Sorry, just a quick addendum to what Nick already said.
No, but it's very fair, and I think it goes to a point which I think in other conversations Mark has referred to. The governance of this whole system really matters. But the governance of the system, I mean, we say build resource, and one of the questions I now want to ask is a quite delicate question, I suppose, is, what in the health sphere, what do we think is the balance of interest for the next 2 years between the bit of the planet which is within the EU 27 and the rest of the world? Because I think I touched on this a bit with Mark, but that's the question I was going to ask Nick. So there are some people in the UK I have talked to in the health space in the past who said, once we're out, we can double down on cooperation with the likes of South Africa or Canada. So there may be, people might see that as a sort of zero-sum question. Who do we prioritize for professional qualifications? Who do we prioritize over there? It might go plurilateral in some areas, such as those we were discussing with Mark. But it seems to me that if we want the TCA's Partnership Council to decide that they want actively to encourage everybody to start talking about filling in the gaps in health, that's quite a big political act. The health minister and the health commissioner have to get together and tell their partners in government, we positively want a prioritization of UK-EU health cooperation. And is that feasible? How's it going to happen? I think that's the million-dollar question. So let's spend 5 minutes. I'd go to all three of you on that. How do we create the political dynamic for actually some of these rather good ideas that you've all come up with to be actively explored in the next couple of years?
Well, let me start on that one, just because you mentioned in while you were introducing the question. If we take a step back, it is lovely to talk about when we talk about, there's this very natural sort of British tendency when thinking about the rest of the world to think about it in very Anglophone terms for very obvious reasons.
It's where we are understood.
The reality of let's step back from the sort of the EU-UK issue as far as migration and workforce is concerned. The global issue is that none of us have enough health workforce. being a doctor, I mean, we've all seen the kind of heroics and the kind of dedication that healthcare professionals have brought over the duration of the pandemic in places around the world. But one of the messages which some people take out of that is, thank you very much, that is not something that I want to do for my career. And we know that we need to be thinking about how do we make working in health and social care something that people actively want to do and find and strikes a balance between their personal and professional lives that they think is acceptable, and the perceptions around that are not what they were 20 or 30 years ago. And the global context here is, we don't go and recruit from Canada and South Africa as the UK. We go and recruit from countries that actually need those staff far more than we do. Our solution to not being able to recruit from the EU, talking to people who are doing this now, is to go to the Philippines, is to go to Indonesia, is to go to the Caribbean, is to go to the Indian subcontinent. And all of those places train excellent staff, but they train them because they flipping well need them. And then we hire them because we can. And so the global commitment, which actually all the European countries have signed up to, is to not be doing that, and is to not be having Europe sucking in the skilled health professionals who are desperately needed and elsewhere in the world, and above all in developing countries. So the question here is not so much, where is that balance in terms of in the world? Because if we look at us in the world, actually, we absolutely and are formally committed to trying to do better in terms of health workforce within our own continent, rather than trying to drain the resources of the rest of the world. The issue is rather short-term versus long-term, because in particular for health professionals, training skilled health professionals is a long-term endeavor, and it is almost invariably beyond the term of office of the person making the decisions now to think strategically. And so that then raises a wider question of governance, which is, how do we create governance systems in general, but in particular for health and social care, which enable us to take decisions which make sense in the long term and are not unduly skewed by the short-term solution of, yes, I know we'd like to have more domestic health and care professionals, but we don't, so we're just going to bung in an extra couple of million and go and recruit some from poorer places in the world, which is all too often the solution.
Yes. I mean, I would only comment before I pass to Tammy and then Mark that you and I failed to get global WHO management of that in the past. And it's probably not the fact of UK departure from the European Union that's going to increase the willingness of net importing countries. But there is a whole WHO reform agenda underway. Our German friends in particular are pushing it hard. So maybe that's an issue where it's not bilateral, but it has to be global. But Tammy and Mark, coming back to the question I was asking, what are your thoughts?
So the question, as I understand it, is how do we create a political environment that encourages the UK and the EU to think of each other as the spaces within which we would naturally cooperate? Yeah. And of course, if you ask an economist that question, they say, well, geography. But if you ask a sociologist or even a political scientist, they're going to have a very different answer. And I don't know so much about how the EU or countries in the EU frame the UK. What I do know is there's a big difference depending on what country you mean. Ireland has a really different relationship with England in particular than, say, I don't know, Germany. But in terms of the UK political discussion and political dynamic, what we're seeing in the short term is a different framing. So I think it's going to be fine to talk about global anything, even if what you actually mean is Europe, as in the case of the global health insurance card. It's also going to be fine to talk about Europe as opposed to the European Union, even if what you actually mean is the countries in the single market. So I think that's one part of what's going to be needed is a different public discourse in the UK about who is it that we're collaborating with when we're doing these collaborations. And I think if I were to apply for some money to do something, I wouldn't be using words like European Union. I'd be using words like European or neighbours or those kinds of words, and those words matter. In the medium to longer term, and I say this as somebody who lives in a leave voting part of the country, I do think this is different in London and perhaps other parts of England than in the parts of England that I know best. There is a much longer term education thing to be done with a cohort of young people who actually are pretty global in their outlook, but have now lost a bunch of opportunities, particularly with the loss of Erasmus, to experience different countries and realize, oh gosh, actually people are just people, and they have the same concerns, and they live in different or interestingly different or similar ways to the ways that we do. So one of the biggest sadnesses about the loss of the Erasmus program for parts of the UK, like the North East, is that very ordinary people who had only, experienced a package holiday or whatever, could go abroad and study under Erasmus because they could actually afford it. Whereas now this is going to be the preserve of wealthier students and young people, these kinds of things. So in the longer term, I think we have really a mountain to climb, certainly in England, in terms of how to frame a political discussion that makes these conversations appealing.
Yes, and the question then arises in the health sphere, picking up also what Nick has said, whether, for example, the Royal Colleges would ever invest in building European connections as well as Commonwealth connections. But I fear that they didn't need to do it during European membership, and they might not want to do it now. Mark, your answer to the question.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. And my reflection would be that the health sector and many other sectors in the UK probably need to become a lot more sophisticated about thinking about different types of international relations they're involved with. And I hope that to some extent our project in the future will help sort of develop that policy competency, because I suspect that this is already the case in countries like Australia and Japan. But we do now need to move beyond that sort of binary EU, non-EU point of view and realise, for example, that health consists of many different sectors. And for some of those, like the movements of patients, you will always be dealing primarily with the countries that are closest to you. For others, like the approval of medicines, the import and export of staff, put it like that, the relevant thing to some extent is culture, way of doing things, language, factors like that, which are distributed across the world to some extent, but again, generally fairly concentrated in Europe as well. And then for still others, like much of life sciences, it's a genuinely global endeavor, where actually the only thing that needs to travel is information and data, and cooperation with even very culturally and structurally different countries like China is only going to expand and expand and expand. And we need to think about that as well. And so I think we'll need to move to a view of the health sector in the UK that interacts with different categories of other countries at many different levels, recognizing with honesty that, as Tammy says, the proximity and the size and the wealth of the EU will always make it a very dominant partner in most things that involve physically moving either people or goods. Yeah. But also realizing that it does need to be a lot more sophisticated than that.
Yeah. So in the last 5 minutes, firstly, to check off on some of the questions that have been asked. The one question about mutual recognition of professional qualifications, I think we've dealt with, that there's no principle of discontinuity, but there's a right to diverge as well as a right for the professions to make joint proposals to the Partnership Council. The second issue, which I think we have not directly dealt with, is health security. And on that, again, there's the possibility for the EU to invite the UK to the Health Security Committee. I don't frankly know whether yet that has been done, but again, it's pragmatic rather than automatic. There's one question that has been brought up, which is perhaps controversial, which is the continued uncertainty as to whether the different jurisdictions approving vaccines are doing it in the right way. So in predictable response to claims that somehow the British flag was bigger because the MHRA approved a vaccine first, people living in other bits of Europe have been saying, no, 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 the slower route is safer. And this sort of argument, I mean, I'd like just to ask if anybody has a view on that. My personal understanding is actually at this stage for these vaccines, everybody is operating according to the same safety and efficacy requirements, and what's a few days between friends. So I fear in a way that this is a debate that proves Tammy's point that we can diverge as human beings and not understand each other, rather than that there's a substantive difference. But does anybody have a take on that?
Absolutely everything you've just said, Robert, on the substance of it. So I mean, the standards are the same. The MHRA opted to use one of the options which was available to both the MHRA and the EMA in terms of the legal framework. The EMA opted to use another for a variety of reasons. Tammy will forgive me, I hope, for using an expression relating to the law, which is, hard cases make bad law. I mean, I think the precise divergence of how we've handled vaccine authorization in the middle of this situation is maybe not the best test case for these situations. But what it does illustrate is the fundamental point, which is that when you end up at different decisions on what look like similar questions to the public, you actually undermine the confidence of the public in all the decisions.
Yes, so I see that.
And that's the fundamental point. So I think over time, what will not be tenable is for the UK or the EMA to persistently come out with different decisions whilst claiming to be following exactly the same standards and processes. And that's going to mean somebody is going to have to say, no, we're doing it differently, and this is how, sooner or later. But my gosh, I hope that they approach that very carefully, because we know how sensitive these issues are. So what we must avoid, for example, from the UK side, is the rush to competitive divergence becoming perceived as an undermining of standards, because if that ever becomes the case, it will be very hard to roll it back.
Yeah. So, Mark,
you say that. I think one of the things that we need to bear in mind in the politics of all this, and why the UK may have chosen to use that accelerated route, is that for vaccines narrowly, the level of public skepticism is much, much lower in the UK than it is in much of the EU, which creates a somewhat different political environment. And I think a really big risk, as Nick has kind of laid out there, is that there may be a sort of an over-optimism or even a naivete about the UK inherently having a politically higher risk tolerance for changes around life sciences that might risk public trust. I suspect it's quite fragile.
Okay, just on that last point, I think that's a very interesting point to follow, in the sense that in Italy and Belgium at the moment, COVID vaccine acceptance is up at 85%, whereas in France it's still around 50%. And I think looking at how that appears in a year's time, when a lot of people have actually been offered a jab, will be a very interesting reset for the work that, for example, the Wellcome Trust is doing so well on vaccine hesitancy. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to take you 60 seconds longer than the promised hour, just to make a few conclusions. My first is we picked the right panelists. Thank you very much, all three of you. And four headlines I take away. The first, which is what Tammy said right at the beginning, in this particular space of health, maybe, just maybe, the deal is kinder to human beings who are involved in its impact than in some other aspects. Secondly, where there is discontinuity by default, as Mark said, there is much scope to co-create additional building blocks in the foundation for health delivery in the continent of Europe. Thirdly, in terms of how to do that, there's a hint or a provision or two in the agreement that says the professions and maybe health actors can co-create work from the bottom up But as Tammy said, without resources and meeting places, that will be a very patchy event, a very patchy process. And my final point, I think, which I think we've sort of stumbled across, is then in order to avoid a zero-sum judgment and a politicized debate about whether Europe is the priority or not, we might need to be very careful to focus on issues where actually the right actors are not just the UK and the EU, where, as with better pharmaceutical regulation, it could be a plurilateral play, whereas with workforce or health security post-COVID, it's actually going to be a WHO agenda. It's important that in those places as well, those who are actors find each other so that the UK voice and the EU voice have the opportunity to speak together. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for keeping you a little over the hour, but as you will have seen, there's a huge amount to unpack. The same is true for every element of the EU-UK emerging relationship, and we look forward to welcoming you back to more such debates in the forum, specifically on health. Look at the website, look at the report. We will try to build a library that can help you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for inviting us.